Hello to our attendees. Just a note that we're going to give it one more minute and let a few more people filter in before we get started. Thanks for joining. Excellent. Well, let's get going. And welcome and thank you all for joining the Mid-City Neighborhood Network Design Lab webinar. We're so grateful that you're able to join us tonight. This Design Lab is part of LADOT's Planning Stress-Free Connections program, where we plan and design strategic infrastructure fixes to create complete networks of neighborhood streets that are safe for people walking and biking. Next slide. The intention of this design lab is to cover a bit of background on our work to date and the data we've collected, share out about the solutions that are available to address barriers to walking and bicycling on neighborhood streets, and discuss considerations that should guide LADOT's decision-making. Next slide. Before we jump in, I'd just like to introduce who we are. So I am Rubina Ghazarian. I'm a supervising transportation planner too at LADOT in the Planning and Policy Division. I'm joined by my colleagues, David Summers and Severin Martinez, also on the Planning and Policy team. On our project team, we are also joined by Jose Alvarez of LANI and Ryan Kusinski of MIG. So we also have many additional partners who are working with us on our project. As we dive in, you'll get to know some of us in the rest of our presentation, as well as in the Q&A. So with that, I'll pass it on to David to introduce us in the project background and context.
All right, thank you, Rubina, and welcome everybody to the webinar. So just a bit of background. The Planning for Stress-Free Connections program is just one strategy LADOT uses to advance the goals of the mobility plan to improve access for all Angelenos by completing networks of low stress, low traffic streets that are comfortable for biking and walking for people of all ages and abilities. And next slide. This network is known as the Neighborhood Enhanced Network. Here we show, actually, if you go back, sorry again, Severin, we're just on this slide, we are showing the Neighborhood Enhanced Network for the mid-city neighborhoods, the focus of this design lab today. And then next slide. And the basic characteristics of neighborhood enhanced networks are that they are primarily low traffic and neighborhood oriented. And the Neighborhood Enhanced Network presents opportunities to improve access for people that bike and walk while discouraging cut-through traffic and reduce speeding and possibly add more greening and active park-like spaces. Streets that comprise these characteristics are places where people of all ages can feel safe walking and biking to common destinations. Next slide. Now, to get to know our attendees a little better, we're gonna administer a quick poll. And the question of this poll is, how comfortable are you riding a bicycle to get to places? So the range of options there is bicycling is not for me, not interested. I would like to bike, but I have concerns. I ride a bicycle, but only where and when I feel safe. And I ride my bicycle without fear anywhere and everywhere. So just give that a minute for those on the call to complete. All right, and we will share results. And so the results are that most folks on the call ride a bike, but only where and when they feel safe. And at least one respondent said, I ride my bicycle everywhere without fear. And which is pretty interesting results. It's good to know those on the call where you are on the spectrum of riding bicycle riding comfort. especially in Los Angeles, where we have high traffic urban streets. And just to ground this result and into with a larger perspective, if we go to the next slide, a national survey of 3,000 people from 50 large metro areas suggests that over 50% of the population would like to bike more, but have some reservations. This is what we typically call the interested and concerned category of folks that would want to bike, but the conditions aren't available to feel comfortable doing so. People regularly say that travel stress, the experience of riding with traffic, is a major concern in choosing to bike. And the next slide. And in an LADOT survey of over 800 people found that 88% of respondents agreed with the statement that they would like to bike more if it were safe and pleasant and convenient. So this is really the grounding under which we understand the exercises that we undertake in terms of understanding travel stress and how far we need to go in order to make it more comfortable. If we go to the next slide. If we're to achieve the mobility plan goals of better access for Angelenos and fulfill LA's climate goals of the city's Green New Deal, we will need to expand opportunities for people of all ages to make trips by biking and walking. We can achieve this goal by reducing travel stress. And LADOT measured travel stress on our neighborhood network through criteria like traffic and speeding, and how safe or unsafe people feel when crossing major streets. Our assessment found that main challenges is intersections, where the neighborhood streets to cross are larger major streets. There's a lack of traffic signals to help people cross major streets on foot or on bike. You could see this where the intersections have red circles scored as high travel stress, where there are no formal crosswalks or signals. So this is essentially us understanding travel stress on our neighborhood network and what we need to do in order to make continual corridors that are safe and comfortable from origin to destination for folks, especially here that we're focused in mid-city. So the next slide is that. So what you were seeing is LADOT data-driven approach on the previous slide, where we compiled the data about traffic and speeding and the conditions at an intersection. To validate our data, we recruited participants to help share their travel stress levels with us. Some of you participated in this, and your assessment largely agreed with our findings that intersections that lack crossings were key barriers. While they also selected a few street segments as having higher travel stress due to traffic or speeding or other conditions that made it uncomfortable to ride amongst traffic. This indicates to us what we need more traffic calming at these streets to be comfortable for all abilities. LADOT is very grateful to those individuals and organizations that helped validate our analysis and have a better understanding of travel stress barriers. I would indicate that there was one intersection that we also focused on that was a little off our network, but one of our participants is identified as of having specific challenges crossing the street and accessing transit there in Little Ethiopia. And so we are we wanted to acknowledge that as well as part of the feedback, which was valuable to us. And we are looking into how to address those concerns with some of our other programs at LADOT. We also discovered that the designated network channels people to very large intersections at San Vicente and Wilshire and Sweetser. That's that number 2 there on the map. And this is a little bit of context here. This is right along city boundaries. And we thought that there may be more optimal routing that we could coordinate with Beverly Hills and to promote bicycle travel along Gale Drive in that section. So if you go to the next slide, you see that link that could be improved there, so that people don't necessarily have to travel through that intersection. That segment is already signalized. So this is something that, but we do understand that there's barriers. The users, participants did identify barriers along this route due to particularly long wait times due to preferential signal timing for traffic along the main streets of Wilshire and San Vicente. So we are coordinating with staff at Beverly Hills on this, and we understand that that there's already improvements underway to retime the signals to make it easier for bicyclists to access this corridor. So that's just suffice to say that the feedback that we've received from this exercise has already is already resulting in real changes, and we look forward to making more of those as we get further into our planning process. So the next slide. So now that we've identified barriers, the next step is to look at design solutions. And I will now pass it over to Severin to talk through how, what are some of the tools that we have available to us to address the barriers to travel stress.
Thank you, David. So we want to take our technical data and the user feedback that we've acquired so far, and use this feedback to identify tools that that we can use to create these low stress neighborhood corridors. Some of these tools you might be familiar with, but others perhaps not so much. So I'll quickly run through what some of the things we're considering currently at the moment. And so you have a better idea of what we mean when we say we want to build out low stress neighborhood corridors. All right. Right, so perhaps one of the most obvious tools in the toolbox is the speed hump. I think a lot of people are familiar with this, but essentially it's it's raised pavement in the middle of a street on a residential streets, and it's used to slow traffic down. Sometimes it can be combined with crossing opportunities so that cars slow down when somebody's crossing at a designated crossing. But yeah, this is a fairly familiar tool that we see throughout the city on neighborhood streets. There's something called chicanes, and what this is, as shown in the visual, is it's landscaping and kind of hard elements that force traffic to actively navigate around these elements so that they're more aware of their surroundings and they're not just coasting on autopilot, driving down a straight street. It does require a bit more attention, so you can't be like fiddling with your phone or whatever. And this, of course, serves to slow down traffic and does offer opportunities to incorporate some modest landscaping. Then there's curb extensions. We also see this a fair amount in the city. This shortens the pedestrian crossing at intersections, and it does require traffic to slow down as they navigate turns, in particular right turns and left turns. But their effectiveness as far as slowing down traffic on a straightaway, it may not be as effective as some of these other tools. There's traffic circles. We are starting to see these crop up around the city, and essentially this forces traffic to navigate in a counterclockwise motion around the intersection if they want to make a right turn or make a left turn or just go straight ahead. And this eliminates conflicts between different directions. So you're less likely to have head-on collisions or T-bones where you have these kind of two opposite streams meeting, because now everybody is navigating around a common space. So the opportunities for conflict are minimized, and it does raise the awareness of everybody traveling so that you're actively looking and navigating space visually. There's something we're calling channelized intersections. And what this does is it requires traffic to turn in just a single uniform direction, though it does maintain through access for people walking and biking, as well as emergency vehicles. And this is a tool that can be strategically placed so that traffic doesn't immediately come in from a major street and then try to use a residential street as a cut-through corridor, but instead it kind of routes traffic back onto a main street and makes it less useful for cut-through purposes. There's another tool called median island, and what this does is it limits through movement, but it still allows traffic to turn right in and right out of a residential street. It also maintains through traffic on the perpendicular street. There's something called enhanced curb extensions, and this is a curb extension that's much more substantial than your typical kind of 3-foot or 5-foot curb extension that we showed earlier. These extend quite a bit into the roadway and physically limit traffic from entering a residential street. You're still allowed to exit on the street as shown in this visual, or it can be the opposite. It can be only allowing traffic to enter but not to exit. And it does maintain through access for walking and biking as well. And then for a lot of these measures, for things like the traffic circles or the median islands or the channelized intersections, these are things that we can do using temporary materials, striping, plastic bollards and signs as a way of testing the measures to see if they're appropriate or if they're working well, and without kind of necessarily committing to an outcome. This, of course, can be less effective. We see sometimes that doing things with temporary measures has less compliance. People maybe, they might drive over the plastic bollards or try to navigate around them. But nonetheless, it can be a good starting point as far as kind of a proof of concept, or to better understand through temporary materials what a final outcome could look like. And then there are things we can do to our existing infrastructure, just modest tweaks to make our neighborhood streets more accessible for walking and biking. And what we see here is an existing intersection that is slightly offset. And what we can do is we can tweak the signal phasing so that what you see in the first box on the left-hand side, phase 1, that's when traffic on the major street has a dedicated light and they can turn in any direction they please. And then when they get a red light, then we provide a green light to just one of the directions on the local street. And this is done so that we can have continuous through movement on the local street and not have to worry about oncoming traffic. And then we can do the same for the opposite direction on the local street to, again, facilitate that movement in a seamless motion, so that if you're, let's say if you're riding a bicycle, you're not necessarily stranded in the middle. And then when traffic has the green light on the major street, you have to try to contend with that traffic. This is a way to separate those movements. And this doesn't require anything new if there's an existing signal. It's just something that we can modify for that benefit. And then there's something called lead pedestrian interval, or sometimes a pedestrian head start. You may have seen these. What this does is it provides a green light for people walking a few seconds in advance of traffic, of vehicle traffic getting a green light. And this is beneficial because, well, pedestrians simply just move slower than cars. So an intersection that a car can clear in 3 seconds might take 15 seconds for a pedestrian to clear. And by giving pedestrians that green light head start, they can get themselves into the intersection. They become more visible so that a driver turning right isn't suddenly caught off guard by a pedestrian stepping off the curb. the pedestrian by that point will have already made it several feet into the intersection, and we can avoid these kinds of potential conflicts. And then, so we take all these tools, and that's how we envision building a substantial portion of our stress-free networks that we're envisioning. So there's going to be some things that require traffic to slow down. There's going to be some elements where we may want to actually reduce the amount of traffic on a residential street, and then providing as well these additional accessibility measures to really prioritize sustainable transportation while maintaining local access, but really discouraging unnecessary cut-through traffic. All right, and now we have another poll, which we will share with you all. So please select your highest priority for designing neighborhood streets. There are 3 options presented here. Okay. All right. Everybody is taking the poll. And here are the results from the participants. So we see that maximizing safety and comfort of people walking and riding bikes is very important, as well as reducing through traffic. Okay. Thank you. Now we have another question. Please select your second highest priority. So we'll launch that. All right, so the results are in, and we see that reducing through traffic in concert with maximizing safety for people walking and riding bikes emerge as the top 2 priorities. And this is perhaps a good sign, because that is those are definitely key elements to building out those neighborhood network that is stress-free and really appealing to people of all ages and abilities. So thank you for participating in that. So we've talked a little bit about some of the tools that are used on our residential streets. There is, of course, the issue which David mentioned a bit earlier, was what we do at major intersections. So with that, I will pass it quickly over to David.
All right, thank you, Severin. So what we're looking at here is a diagram of the network where we have intersections that have some type of signal control. Most of them, or if not all, have a full signal, versus those that have no control or guidance that would support vehicles or yield stopping right away for pedestrians to cross the street. These are examples where if you look at, go to the next slide there, Severin. So I think this should be those intersections should be highlighted. Yes. So these are the intersections that we'll be further exploring as in our planning process to design solutions that would help to solve those gaps in the network and to address that user comfort and safety when crossing these major arterials. So I'm going to hand it back over to Severin to talk about what those types of intersection solutions would need to be in order to address some of those challenges that result in an uncontrolled crossing, that, you know, where you're biking or walking, you come to a stop sign and there's no clear guidance on how to cross that street. So I'll yield that back over to Severin.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so when it comes to crossing major streets, you know, I think for a long time, the only kind of solution that that we collectively maybe envision is installing a traffic signal, right? Because that's one way to stop traffic while providing access on the local street. But what we see is that sometimes this can invite more cut-through traffic on residential streets, because if you're driving and you know that, oh, there's a residential street parallel to this busy street where I can, you know, trigger a green light and just proceed, that can be an appealing option for somebody looking to avoid traffic on a major street. Of course, the downside is that this makes the residential street less appealing for these more environmentally friendly ways of getting around where we want to make it appealing. So one of the tools, which some of you may be familiar with, is something that's called a rapid rectangular flashing beacon, or simply flashing yellow lights is what I hear people refer to them a lot of times. And what this does is it provides a button for somebody walking or biking to push that activates flashing yellow lights and lets you get across the major street. This tool is typically used when you only have to cross one lane in each direction. It isn't really advised when you have to cross multiple lanes of traffic. So it does have some limited application, but we see here in this diagram the kind of context where it might be an appropriate tool. And then should there be funding in place, this is always something that can be made more substantial and more aesthetically pleasing, incorporating landscaping, maybe a pedestrian island so that it breaks up the crossing. You know, these aren't necessarily things that come standard with a flashing beacon, but it is something that can be considered. And here's a couple examples, which you probably may have seen something like this around town. But more often, when we need to cross busy streets, they look something like this. You have at least 2 lanes in each direction, and maybe there's a left turn lane. And this can be quite challenging to cross as somebody walking or biking. Now, this is a fairly new tool in the toolbox, but something that we are looking to consider is what's called a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And what this is, it effectively functions as kind of like a super stop sign. So you push a button as somebody walking or biking, and then it triggers a red light for traffic on the major street. This is different from a traditional traffic signal because it does not trigger a green light on that local street. So what you see in the upper right there is if you're on the local street and you're driving in a car, you're going to have a stop sign just as you do in kind of the existing conditions here. So if you're looking to use this local street as your convenient cut through, that isn't necessarily going to help you any, because traffic is not going to be required to stop for you under any circumstance. And then we see here what this can look like, again, if we have the resources and funding in place to make this more of a complete project. Here's a couple examples. And what you'll notice is that there's push buttons oriented towards the people walking and biking. On the right-hand side, that's an example from Portland. And there is a pedestrian signal that you might be able to see in the background, but there's no corresponding traffic signal for vehicle traffic, right? So that's how you avoid kind of incurring that that traffic, but there is a red light for the major street. As you see on the left-hand side, you can see what that looks like with a local example here in Los Angeles. And those aren't the only tools. We also have something called the Toucan, and this refers to the fact that two modes of travel can cross, people walking and biking. And this is what this looks like. It, to the, kind of at first glance, it might look like a typical traffic signal, and in many ways it probably is. The distinction is that if you're traveling on the local streets, there's only green lights for people walking and biking, and vehicle traffic, as shown in this diagram, is required to turn right. So again, this is a way to improve access across our busy streets without inviting more automobile traffic. And again, there's opportunities to incorporate curb extensions so that we can reduce the pedestrian crossing, but this isn't necessarily a given, especially if we have funding constraints. And traffic on the major street, as you can see, can turn onto the local street. It's really just that movement on the local street that now is required to turn right. Here's a couple of examples. We have one locally that you may have experienced on Rosewood and La Brea, but it's something that is increasingly being seen throughout the country. And now there's a different kind of Toucan as well, kind of same standard situation. The difference here is that we can adjust the movements that we want to allow for vehicle traffic on the local street. So what you see here is that if you're on that local street, you can turn left or right onto the major street. So in that prior example, you could only turn right, but in this example, you can turn left or right. The difference here is that you can't turn onto the local street if you're driving from the major street or from the local street. So it's only through for people walking and biking, but it, depending on the local circumstances, you may find that this kind of Toucan is perhaps preferable over the other kind, or vice versa. Maybe it's more important to maintain local access onto the local street. So you might want to do the Toucan type 1, the kind of Rosewood La Brea situation, or maybe it's more important to give options to exiting the local street. So there is some variation in what we can do. And again, curb extensions, crossing islands, these are all things that can be thought about in a holistic way. And we have one example that's kind of functions like this locally at the intersection of 8th and Fairfax. And then on the right-hand side, we also see kind of what this looks like on the ground through an example in Portland. So, so it kind of looks like a typical traffic signal, but it really is preventing that through movement. And then sometimes what we experience here locally is that there's a lot of offset intersections. So this isn't kind of like your standard intersection where there's two kind of clear directions. A lot of our local streets we see, they are contiguous. So you can keep traveling north, south, or east, west, depending on the direction. But it does require to kind of navigate in kind of a jug handle motion through a major intersection. So if we have a street that looks like this, or an intersection that looks like this, we can make modifications to make this more accommodating for walking and bicycling. So what we see here is that we have created a two-way protected bike lane on one side of the street that provides a seamless transition through the intersection so that people can proceed on the local street and minimize their exposure to vehicle traffic. This doesn't necessarily change anything in how cars are permitted to move, but it is kind of a context-sensitive application of what we can do to how we can change our existing infrastructure to make it more accessible. And of course, if there is funding in place and maybe the local context warrants it, we can think about more substantial changes, doing something like this, where we add an actual new traffic signal to the other side of the intersection, if you will, and provide accommodations to make a seamless transition, in this case showing a protected bike lane in either direction so that you can get through the intersection without being exposed to vehicle traffic. It would require removing some parking, as would the prior option, where we make use of existing tools or existing infrastructure. But this is all something that can be considered as a way of, again, improving access on our local streets. And here's an example from Portland. So, all told, it can be a relatively minor change, but it can be a meaningful one in the way that people get around safely. And with that, we have another poll, which I will administer. All right. So the question is, would you be willing to take a different way to travel or to drive to reduce cut-through traffic and make it more comfortable for more people to walk and bike on neighborhood streets? All right. The results are in, and we see that by and large, the participants in this webinar would in fact be willing to make some changes in order to facilitate a more comfortable setting for people to get around by walking and biking, or that it depends, right? Because if it's going to require maybe a substantial rerouting or some other kind of change, maybe that's something that would require a little bit closer inspection to see if it kind of merits the trade-offs in your perspective. So thank you for participating in that. All right, now we have another poll question. So to help everyone feel safe and comfortable, would you be willing to add time to your driving trip? So this is kind of a subtly different question from the other one. The other one asked, would you be willing to make a change? This one is asking specifically about adding time to your driving trips. Okay, I think I'll go ahead and close this. So what we see among the participants here, that there is definitely a willingness to add some time to your driving trips. Could be 3 minutes, it could be as much as it takes. Of course, at the end of the day, it all kind of depends on what the actual circumstances are, but we do appreciate you participating and giving us some insights into how you feel about this. Okay. And
All right.
I'll pass it back over to David.
Yeah, thanks so much, Severin. That was a great overview on some of the design choices that we have available to us. Now that you've known the difference in some of the devices in the toolbox, I'm going to talk through the factors that LADOT considers in approving some of these control device is now really focused still at the intersection where you have those uncontrolled and no guidance for pedestrians and people that walk and bike currently to cross the street. So this diagram may be a little challenging to interpret, but I'll break it down for you. The chart shows the factors we use to install either the choice between a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, shown in the acronym here is the RRFB. That was the first intersection crossing device that Severn reviewed, followed by versus the protected hybrid beacon known as the PHB. So this is the guidance that LADOT uses whether to decide to place either a RFB or a PHB. Now, the rapid flashing beacon provides additional awareness for drivers to yield to pedestrians at a crosswalk. However, they are less effective in alerting a driver's attention to stop for people crossing the street as a PHB is. That protected hybrid beacon, remember, has that blinking red signal and functions essentially like a stoplight for that major crossing traffic with some variation, but they are alerted to stop and they're expected to comply. And they've shown that research has shown that that device does indeed have a fairly high compliance rate. Now, LADOT's guidance suggests that the rapid flashing beacons may only be appropriate where there is a need to cross smaller roads with fewer lanes or with lower speed limits or lower traffic volumes. And that's essentially what this graphic is showing. You see this at the top left of the table where these conditions exist. Conversely, LADOT would choose PHBs, the protected hybrid beacons, over the flashing rectangular rapid flashing beacons as an appropriate crossing device where streets have more travel lanes, higher speed limits, and greater traffic volume. So the first decision in improving access at a major intersection is determining how much attention to command of drivers to stop for people crossing the street, which is based on the characteristics of the major street one needs to cross. So that at least established one dimension of the decisions that need to be made in selecting which of the tools would be appropriate for that location. Now we're going to move on and talk about the specific options at the options available to us at the specific intersections. And so you'll see this diagram once again. This chart grounds us in the context of the Mid-City Neighborhood Network, where we show which intersection would meet LADOT's guidance for either a RRFB or PHB. And almost all of the intersections along the network have characteristics that would disqualify an application for a rectangular rapid flashing beacon in and of itself. And at a minimum, they would require a protected hybrid beacon that better guarantees that stop control. And the intersection that was identified at, we talked about earlier at Packard and Fairfax, where there's specific challenges there, is really the one that stands out as perhaps being eligible for being supported by a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. So I wanted to just go over that just to provide that at least one dimension of the decision-making process of what we would be approved to cite. And we go to the next slide. We're going to get into these specific intersections in a little bit more detail. And those are those intersection crossing points highlighted in the graphic there. We'll be going over those that are along the network one by one. We'll be talking through these design decisions for each intersection and some of the choices that we have available there. So at this point, we're going to try to get a little bit more interactive on this section of the webinar. If you go to the next slide, we're going to start talking about the specific characteristics at a glance of these individual intersections. And we have our team available here at MIG. What we ask you to do is if you have specific feedback that you want LADOT to know about in advance of making this kind of determination of what kind of device to apply, the level of access that would be maintained at an intersection, we'd ask you to provide that in the Q&A, and we're going to enter that as a sticky note, as a mural. So we're going to I'm gonna migrate over to that, but I do see that we do have a hand raised. So yeah, so if we can you're unmuted now.
You're
I think
unmuted now. I think.
if
Oh,
you can
okay. Thank you,
introduce.
sir. Hi. Good evening. My name is Saray, and I'm actually in a neighborhood council, which is how I frequently hear about these events. And but I actually just asked the question in the chat. I didn't know that you were going to unmute me, but it was a basic question about, is this correspondence particularly for Mid-City? Or are you guys taking recommendations for other streets?
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah,
Saray.
thanks for that, Saray.
Looks
you.
like I might have to mute you.
Looks
now
like I might have
because-
to mute you
Yeah,
now
I can hear a little
because-
feedback.
Yeah, I can-
There we go. Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Saray, for asking that. So yes, well, for the design lab tonight, we're going to be focused on these specific locations in Mid-City, but we are expanding. We do have three other focus geographies as a part of this planning effort. We are focused in the central, what we call the central city subregion, which essentially those three other geographies include what we consider the central LA neighborhoods, which is more or less Koreatown, East Hollywood, and Greater Wilshire. And then we have neighborhoods that we're focused on in South Los Angeles, which is kind of Expo Park, University, and then further to the east, more in the a little bit south, a little bit of adjoining the Crenshaw area. And then we also have a focused area in Watts. So this is the first design lab that we are hosting for the 4 geographies we're focused in. So tonight, again, we're focused on Mid-City, but we will be also discussing that in some of the options available to us and what we've encountered in terms of travel stress for those geographies as well. And if you want to have more specifics on that, we'll provide you the program email as well in the Q&A, so that you could follow up with us afterward, and we can provide you the precise geographies of our other program areas. So thank you for that. And so at this point, we're going to be going over each of these intersections here and talking about some of our design choices that we have available to us, and what type of considerations that we should make that what types of things we should consider in citing device. Now, I should also say at this point, the first decision that we have is that dimension of, what is that characteristics of the major street that we need to get the driver's attention to stop for a pedestrian, where a wider street, more travel lanes, and it's faster and more traffic. We need a more, intensive device that functions more like a stop signal to get folks to stop. And by and large, that's making the criteria in all of these intersections that we'll be talking about. But the second decision is to improve access. Will involve if we should restrict some access by traffic in order to encourage a calm street that will be less stressful for people that walk and bike. This could involve the use of what Severin described as a Toucan treatment. He discussed 2 types of treatments there that are known as the Toucan, as opposed to protected hybrid pedestrian hybrid beacon, where the limits of cut-through traffic is a desired goal. And both would command the same degree of drivers' attention to stop. So the major crossing in both circumstances get some form of that red ball, like a stop, like a traffic light, the red phase of a traffic light, though the Toucan will be more restrictive in only allowing certain directions of traffic through an intersection. So the important thing to note in all these cases, whether it's a pedestrian hybrid beacon or a Toucan, though, is the idea is to avoid putting in a traditional traffic signal, where we know from experience that just signalizing an intersection can actually invite more cut-through traffic if drivers know that they can have a side street with a series of traffic signals that provide the same level of through access by car or a major street. So instead, we need new solutions that better improve user experience. And that's what will along residential streets. So that's what we're going to be exploring here. So the first intersection we're looking at is Edinburgh and Beverly. And for those that may be familiar with this intersection, what type of, if there's any considerations that we should think about, if it's really thinking about that option of restricting some level of vehicle movement. In one option would be that you saw the protected, or the Toucan phase 1, where you're allowing only right turns from that from the local street onto, in this instance, onto Beverly, restricting through movement and left turns if we're applying that Toucan that we referred as the type 1 approach. The type 2 approach would be restricting movements onto Edinburgh from Beverly, only permitting outward movement onto Beverly from that local street. So that's the differentiation there. What we have to assist us is we did take volume data from our streetlight vendor, which essentially allows us to understand the general use of that intersection by the existing travel. So here you have the percentage of movements that are taking either a through movement or right turn or left turn at that intersection. And by and large, and especially for the northbound movement, the wide majority of cars are already accessing Beverly by making right turns. It's a little bit more balanced in the southbound direction, but that's what you see with the existing characteristics. So if there's no questions, and this is how we're going to curate this. If there's, you could also, we have a sizable enough group. If you could also raise your hand if you have specific comments, and we can also populate on the whiteboard. But if I don't hear folks chime in, I'm just going to move on to the next intersection. And then Severin, could we go to back to the presentation, and you see the intersection at, I think the next one will be at also at Beverly. Edinburgh and Melrose. So
David,
yeah, go ahead, Rubina.
I was just going to add, if there's perhaps we can, please feel free to use the chat feature if there are specific locations of interest. I think it'd be helpful for us to know, and we can perhaps navigate to those directly. Thank you.
Right. And the chat feature, and as in the Q&A, the Q&A box, you can just provide that as if it's a question. And then so you have here the intersection at Melrose and Edinburgh. This is the just a photo off Street View of what that intersection looks like if people are familiar with navigating this street here. And then Severin, if you go to the next slide, you look at the intersection movements. There are also dominantly right turns, but you do have some level of movement going straight through the intersection and to a little bit more left. So if we're going to be restricting those movements, through the use of a Toucan, those presuming that people would reroute to another location. And then so we're gonna start going to the Q&A here. Let's see. So Oren has indicated that most interested in Packard and Fairfax. If time permits, we could certainly talk about that. That's one of we can make it. Yeah. So if we can get through the discussions on the other 6 intersections, we can preserve some time for that. And then that comment seems to be seconded by Nikki. Thank you. And then so Julia asked a question: should we be thinking about cost as we're weighing in on these options? If there's unlimited budget, maybe we should be implementing the safest design treatment. So at this stage, it's good to highlight. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but there is not a defined budget for the construction as of yet, because this is really at the planning stage of this process, and that once we've identified what our needs are, then we would be going to pursue a likely grant applications that would cover the cost of the solutions that we're looking at. And I don't have an estimate off the top of my head in terms of, the difference between saying, PHB or a Toucan treatment. I think it's safe to conclude that if anything is eligible for RFB, that is substantially less cost than something that is more or less, the protected hybrid beacons are more or less like a signal in terms of their operational characteristics. But we might be able to get more information there from those on the call. So if there isn't any specific feedback on the intersections, we'll just be going to the next location. And that is, this is the one at Sweetser and Melrose. So similarly here, that's just a depiction of what this intersection looks like. If you're familiar with this location, again, we'll go to the next slide will show us that turn movement diagram. And here, once again, you see the large majority of turn movements are already taking that right turn. Actually, go back one slide, I think. Okay, so this wasn't one of the ones that you already have turn restrictions. We'll get to one of those. So yeah, you already see a dominance of movement of right turns at this location. And if there's any specific considerations on this intersection, we can walk through what those maybe, at least just collect your feedback. And if not, we can move on to the next intersection. I think that is going to be one up on Crescent Heights and Waring. This is an interesting intersection here because you may see note in the photo, you already have guidance that says a sign that says right turn only. And so if all we are doing is just formalizing what is already the existing rule, then a Toucan operationally would not change really the baseline, at least the baseline expected behavior would be. But you do see within the diagram here that that's not necessarily complied with. It is in the westbound movement, but it appears that in the eastbound movement that there may be 50%, up to 50% of people that are still making through and left turn movements there. So ultimately, what would be the result of placing a Toucan there would essentially be committing more compliance to the existing expected behavior. And so I'll answer the question in the chat. Can you remind us what PHBs and toucans look like, or share a link to the part of the presentation where you show them? So yeah, I think if, let's see, if as I walk through this, I do think that we can get we can answer that in the chat. Probably the best. Well, we could do, if we have a little bit of time, we could go back to the maybe it would be, would this be a good time then maybe just to pivot back, Severin, to the showing the difference between the pedestrian hybrid beacons and toucans on the presentation slide deck.
Yeah. Might be easiest to just jump to that section. So yeah, so there were the two different kinds of toucans, one which limited vehicle traffic on the local street to turning right. It still allowed traffic on the major street to access the local streets. And then the alternative kind of configuration was where traffic on the local street can turn left or right onto the major street, but nobody can turn onto the local street. So traffic on the major street can't make left turns onto that local street. They can't make right turns onto that local street. They can only continue through the intersection. So those were those two kinds of toucans. And then the hybrid beacon, it doesn't change anything how the intersection operates for cars. The cars, if the existing conditions today is just you have a stop sign and you kind of have to judge your movement by a gap in the traffic. That's still going to be the case with the pedestrian hybrid beacon. What's different is that people walking and biking are able to use a push activated button to trigger a flashing red for traffic on the major streets. Were there any questions or clarifying kind of comments we can make on that front?
It looks like Julia's raised her hand, Severin. So maybe we can unmute.
Yeah,
and
we'll do that.
elaborate a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much for doing this. This is a wonderful presentation so far. And thanks for going back to these definitions. As a cyclist and somebody who walks a lot in mid-city, the pedestrian hybrid beacons that I've experienced in LA seem to work better when cars are already going slower and the streets are more like neighborhood streets with lower traffic. It can be a little bit scary as a cyclist or somebody who's walking to head out into the intersection when you just have those lights flashing or the stop signs, because so many cars do just run those or they don't really respect those. So the Toucan Type 2 seems to me like maybe a better approach for some of the faster intersections that you had shown previously, David.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Julia. So one clarification, just to, because the pedestrian hybrid beacon has the red ball like a stop light. Just to clarify, if you were thinking about what you experience when you're riding your bike in LA, is it the rapid flashing beacons at a crosswalk, or is it the what Severin was showing before as the pedestrian hybrid beacon as when you were saying the feature that may not get as much compliance?
It was the pedestrian hybrid beacon. I'm thinking specifically actually of it's not in mid-city, but in Hollywood, there's a pedestrian hybrid beacon. like in Thai Town, East Hollywood. I forget what the other intersection is. But yeah, it's the
Right.
pedestrian hybrid beacon.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for clarifying. And then so yeah, that's a helpful comment. So that's that toucans would be at least in your experience, it may be felt that a toucan would commit more people to stop and for that compliance. I'm not necessarily sure what the research off the top of my head. The pedestrian hybrid beacon does have a pretty high compliance rate, at least as compared to the rapid flashing beacon. I think it's between like the rapid flashing beacon has an 80% compliance versus a pedestrian hybrid beacon. It's in the high 90% range. So it is head and shoulders above at least that, but I can definitely understand the toucan being having its advantages, especially when considering what we're thinking about through here is the volumes and the through movement. Severin, if we can go back to the location of where we ended up at I think we were talking about Waring and what was the intersection there? Yeah. Waring and Crescent Heights. So if there's yeah, and if that's I guess if that's any specific feedback that for this intersection at Waring and Crescent Heights, as I mentioned before, you have the higher well, the toucan is really not really introducing a new regulation on this intersection that we're looking at here, because you already are restricted from making through movements, at least as the regulatory signage has there. If we go to and if there is any specific feedback for that intersection, we will and it looks like we do have some feedback in the chat. Toucans would be great along Crescent Heights. West Hollywood implemented Sharrows on Romaine a couple years ago, but there isn't a way to cross Crescent Heights. And I guess that's in Hollywood then, or West Hollywood. So thank you for the feedback there. We'll make a and we're recording all these comments here for posterity. So we do appreciate. So it is qualifying there. That's the intersection is in LA. Thank you. So we'll definitely consider that as that toucans have that there is a preference there for the toucans. Now moving on to Waring and Fairfax. So at this intersection, this is a little bit different than the other intersections we've looked at. Currently, if you can make it out in the photo below, you do have a crosswalk at this location. There's no there's a sign, but there's no other indication that drivers are expected to stop that you would expect to see, like even a rapid flashing beacon that doesn't exist. And in fact, a rapid flashing beacon, as we talked about in the guidance, would not be LADOT wouldn't approve to site at this location. So really the choices involved here, once again, is looking at upgrading this location as a protected hybrid beacon or implementing as a toucan. And if you go to the next slide and you see the turn movements here at this intersection, similar to others, a higher degree of right turn volume that they're experiencing there, and much lower through movements. There doesn't seem to be that much advantage with the stop signs there and a fairly wide street at Fairfax to cross just with the assistance of a stop sign. So some left turn movements. So there would be expected to be a little bit of adjustments there. But yeah, we will certainly consider if there's anything that we need to capture. And so on to, if there's no further comments for this intersection, if we can go on to the next one. And then so this is the intersection at Waring and Highlands. And you do have, again, similar to the intersection we saw before, the guidance, at least the behavior that's expected in accordance to the signage and the regulation is that only right turns are permitted here. And it's actually supported by those median bollards. So it's a little bit more, I guess, reinforced by some type of, some type of treatment that is, it's a little better than a sign. And once again, if we are upgrading this location as a Toucan, there's really no effective change in the expected operation of the street. But then if we go to the next slide, 7, we do see that, at least for the period that we pulled this data, I'm not really sure when the right turn restrictions were enforced, but the data that we pulled was just from 2019. And during that time, there was, some degree of non-compliance with that existing rule or regulation. So a Toucan in this circumstance would, if anything, just reinforce what that existing behavior, the behavior is expected there. And so, so I think we will, if there's any, I guess, comments or questions during this section.
David, I also wanted to ask if Charlie Ho, who's joining from LADOT Active Transportation, would like to elaborate on any of what provide any additional context. And Charlie, please feel free to jump in.
Sure.
If you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, Rubina and David. I think David pretty much covered it all. So I just kind of want to go back to the previous question regarding PHB and Toucan. I think, like David mentioned, PHB has a pretty high compliance rate as it is. I think the difference is, sometimes it's a little bit unfamiliar to the drivers, and they're not expecting it. And, sometimes that could result in a lower compliance rate. Whereas a Toucan, on the major street, you'll see it as a signal, and that's pretty self-explanatory, and obviously that's going to have a higher compliance rate. But the trade-off between a Toucan and a PHB would be that since it is a signal, Toucan, since it is a signal on the minor street, the vehicles on the minor street, they're going to see a green, and even though we can. The pavement markings and the signs is going to tell them, hey, you got to turn right, or you're going to, have to not go straight. But, there is that chance that it's easier for them to still kind of go through past the intersection. So, thereby, kind of makes it easier for cut through traffic, or higher chance of non-compliancy on the minor streets. But and cost-wise, I think it's technically pedestrian hybrid beacon is less than Toucan. But with the cost kind of going up nowadays, I'm not sure what's the cost difference now, but in general, PHB is typically a little bit lower cost. But as David mentioned, we're kind of still in the planning stage, and just having that input from you, feeling a little bit safer with the Toucan and PHB, I think it's very, very valuable. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Charlie, for providing more details on the advantages of the operation and the cost. So we're essentially coming to the end of this section of the webinar, where we're talking about the specific treatments. If there's no, at least at the treatments that we are considering for these specific intersections, if more thoughts come to mind in terms of, if there's factors that we should consider in placing either a Toucan versus a pedestrian hybrid beacon, you can also just email us at the Stress-Free Connections email. Yeah, Oren, we were gonna so I mean, I think we could talk. We do have a question about the Packard and Fairfax intersection. We are discussing routing that question internally. So one thing to underscore is that technically Packard isn't on the neighborhood enhanced network, so we're trying to see where those needs can be addressed through parallel program. We are in touch with the engineer in Vision Zero that is, I'm sorry, the planner in Vision Zero that is working on the Great Streets application, but we can certainly talk about some of the specific needs there, because it does seem that we have a little bit of time. That we actually went through that portion a little bit faster than expected. So if there's a little bit more feedback, I don't know if there's a specific we have, let's see, where was I did have a little bit of info there. I could provide for just some context. And sorry, I don't have a slide for this prepared, but we do have the some of the turning movements at the Packard and Fair, because we did pull that data. It does look like the turning movements there at the for right turns are for the I think would be the eastbound movement is about 63%, which is pretty high, and then the westbound movements are a little bit more balanced. And if there's anything more that we really need to consider, we did talk about also that location because of it has a bit lower. I'm sorry, I'm just referencing some of the details that I had for that intersection. The characteristics of that, because it's just 2 lanes, it does fit within the chart to apply either a rapid flashing beacon or a PHB. It's not as wide of a street to cross as the other streets that we're looking at on our neighborhood enhanced network. So it is something that I think presents a little bit more options as far as what design treatments would be. But yeah, but suffice to say, we are exploring at least documenting the needs there for other partner programs. So we are essentially identifying that in our long range investment program, so that hopefully we'll be looking at opportunities to address some of the challenges that were brought up in the network audit exercise. It was pretty valuable. Is there anything else that we need to know about that? Packard is a permanent slow street extending 1 block east of Fairfax. So as a result of that, ped and bike volumes would be expected to increase. So that's good to know. That certainly could contribute to its use, and something that we want to consider, especially as there's been discussions about making slow streets permanent, the types of treatments that would be required. We would want to explore a little bit more. It is a tricky location, just because when we were there, we did notice that there was no sidewalks on one side of Packard. So if we're citing like even a rapid flashing beacon, they'd have to construct the sidewalks and just, so there would be additional commitments, I think, that extend beyond the scope of some of the other changes that we're seeing with these intersections that we'd have to explore a little bit further. Yeah, let's I think we can look at that on Severin. Could you just open up a Google Maps just to show
Sure.
that location?
Sorry, seems to be a little laggy. Yeah, one moment.
If you just bear with us, I think we'll be able to see that.
All right, let me share. Okay. So is this what you were referring to? And
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So if you zoom in a little bit, so yeah, as you can see there, there's no sidewalk on that eastern leg. So, essentially, I think if we were to address this condition here, it may involve a little bit more interdepartmental coordination than some of our other locations are. So we don't have, this. It's a little bit more complex in terms of how we would bring this up to more or less a standard condition. If you go to the street view at that, just to maybe look at that from a just from the regular perspective. So you see, and there definitely is needs, no doubt. If you pivot to the left there, that's where you see you do have a sidewalk landing, but again, no sidewalk along that property frontage. It's possible that you may need to have a better landing there for a rapid flashing beacon. If you just kind of pivot to the left a little bit, yeah. And also with some storm drain utilities. So yeah, I mean, this would certainly require just a little bit more investment in working with another agency. I do think that the venue for this may be a good continue to champion this within the Great Streets program, because that program does have a bit more interagency coordination. I did consult again the Vision Zero planner to make sure that this was addressed in that exercise as well, so that at least it's documented as something that when we do look for funding in the future, that's a need that could be addressed in that in a future funding exercise. But there's also, if you turn around all the way, I know that I remember seeing this area of the bus, but you also have a bus stop that where you really have like poor visibility, it looks like, from that southern leg. If you go to there, if you go to the so keep turning around, go see if you can 180. Yeah, so you can barely see it, but that's a bus stop right in front of that hedge. So not ideal. That you probably, and it's certainly not a lot of sidewalk width there too. So there may be advantages to potentially relocating that, but so that's probably more than we can get into in this just in this discussion offhand, just because I think we would need to really enlist some of our agency partners in Streets LA and Bureau of Engineering to see what we could do to really bring this location up to a standard condition that would meet some of the requirements, especially under the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, to cite a rapid flashing beacon here, but it's something that we could certainly explore in the future. So it looks like Nikki, you have your hand raised. Would you like to share about this?
Yes, thank you very much for letting me speak. Thank you for bringing Packard and Fairfax into the light. It wasn't even part of your list. You went out of your way to do this. So my understanding is there is no funding, and we have to wait for funding to do this. I have been advocating for 2 years for the 1000 block in the middle of the businesses that doesn't have any ramp, with Great Street and with different agencies, and that hasn't been done. So I really honestly don't know when Packard and Fairfax will get attention, but thank you very much for the work you've done. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Definitely. And thank you for your feedback and just bringing this to our attention. I know these things can seem terribly slow from the public side, but do know that this is we're aware of the desires here, and that there's continuing to explore funding options from our program and development team, and it did help us to instigate some additional conversations internally. So we definitely don't want this location to be lost in the mix, and because we do know that it was should be part of that that larger Great Street scope. And we'll be continuing to look out for that. This might be a good time to pivot back to where we are, where we'd like, actually, that's a good transition at this point to talk about next steps, because ultimately, we're kind of in the same place as that. This is a planning process. We're identifying needs. You're helping us to focus our lens on what we need to look at in order to improve conditions of bicycling and walking. This is something that, is certainly within that scope. And so just to bring you up to speed of where we are in the bigger picture, if we go to the next slide, we are currently hosting similar design lab sessions in the other focused areas that I mentioned earlier, in the central LA and South LA and Watts areas. So this is the first one. So thank you all for participating. We will, when we conclude these discussions of design labs, we'll compile our analysis and the feedback we've collected to date into a report where we'll be presenting our findings to City Council. We may be making preliminary recommendations in corridors and design options to pursue, though final decisions on specific design outcomes will be made at a later time once we do have the funding procured to develop more detailed designs and are able to install, construct and install. So project implementation would be phased and could be phased, and that's actually in our next slide here. Project implementation would be phased in short and long term, as we covered. The advantage, this is where I believe the advantages of this program is it does allow us, I think, to make some significant gains in where we can pilot short-term improvements while we continue to seek funding for more extensive improvements. So some solutions will lend themselves to what we call the quick build concepts and interventions in signage and striping, allowing us to realize some gains in that short term. And what you see here in the image is just that. You see signs that have been installed to channelize or make that street one direction, as we saw, that would really reduce the amount of travel volume and make that a more comfortable experience for people biking on a very low cost, low intensive improvement. We can make a lot of gains. And then while we go and seek out those funding sources, we could then realize, once we do get those funding sources, to put in some more civil intensive improvements where you may see a little bit more green space and vegetation in some areas, and hopefully in some areas we may even see opportunities to put in more substantial greening, such as restoring some degree of tree canopy, even. But that would be something more in the long term. But we do think that planning for these types of projects on neighborhood streets, we can see a lot of success. When we an example is coordinating with a partner jurisdiction, like we had that conversation with Beverly Hills when we identified that segment of Gale Drive that could serve as a perfectly suitable bicycle corridor, but it just had that signal timing issue really holding it back. So these are some early wins I think we can make while we continue to explore future funding opportunities. Do we have, looks like we have some folks still with their hand raised. Is that, Nikki, is that a new hand or was that from before? I'll unmute you there.
Oh, it's from before. Thank you.
Okay, sure thing. And then Oren.
Hi, yes, I just had a question about the sort of quick build implementation. The improvements that we've talked about so far have all been kind of big ticket items that, would be, I don't know, maybe I don't have the right imagination, but it seems like it would be hard to pilot pedestrian hybrid beacon or a Toucan. But, a lot of the other interventions, like the traffic circles and chicanes and things like that, we haven't really discussed. And those, I assume, are the things that are on the table when you're talking about quick build stuff. So are you also considering treatments at minor intersections or mid-block that we just didn't have time to talk about? Or are you really just focused on the major intersections?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. So the reason that we focused on major intersections is because largely that, for one, that's where most of the challenges really are from a travel stress framework, and where kind of a higher level of decisions need to be made in terms of how those how the street is to be operating. So it is, the intersections are asking a little bit more in terms of people making adjustments from maybe their day-to-day, how they travel through those corridors. When we talk about the chicanes, we talked about Severin, went over the rest of that toolbox of, speed humps, curb extensions that, and other tools that may be available at minor intersections. Those, I think in our eyes, the reason we didn't focus on those as much in this discussion is that they're not as rigorous as I guess a lift in terms of decision points. I think with the exception there being maybe you do have curb extensions, and large to extent chicanes could involve some reallocation of parking, which could be some conversations that need to be had, certainly. But it isn't, but I guess I would just clarify that those weren't necessarily the most pronounced challenges that we saw, but they are definitely things that could be woven in and either complementary to the suite of tools that we're looking at specifically at the intersections. But yeah, I mean, those are still in the toolbox. I think when we get into a next stage would be we apply for we define what we're trying to accomplish here in terms of the travel stress characteristics that we want to see, the level of comfort that we want to see, and then develop a more or less a scope of work that we would then go to a grantor to say, hey, can we have this idea that this is what we want to see, and these are solutions that we want. At that point in time, when we actually secure the funding, we would go into much greater depth in terms of the types of things that would be perceived to be part of that scope of work, where that would be more or less finalized. So hopefully that answers a little bit. I know that there was, let's see, there's another question that's similar to that. I'd be interested in lower lift improvements at smaller intersections and how we can get them prioritized. Yeah, I mean, this is part of the feedback process. So if there are intersections that need specific attention, this is the time, I think, to define that, and that would help us enroll that into future a scope of work for funding, especially if it's specifically on a corridor that we're evaluating that's on the neighborhood enhanced network. We understand that there could be needs and challenges even at the minor intersections, where you may see people speeding or maybe not complying with the stop signs that are there. So there are opportunities for that, and I think that we can provide again, the program contact, yes. So great. Thank you, Rubina, for providing the program contact that we could continue to take feedback there. So
David,
let's see.
If there's, sorry, I also wanted to just elevate that a part of Michael's question related to how can my neighbors and I work with LADOT to advocate for improvements along, in this case, Whitworth, but I think this question is generally, I guess one that it would be potentially relevant for any location, right? I don't want that one, I guess just elevating that one. And I think that's like a second question that was raised as part of the first question.
Right. Yeah, sorry, I missed that. I do see that in the chat here, and we did take note of that. So Whitworth is on the low stress corridor on the mid city on our maps, and yeah, I mean, I think we'll definitely want to have your contact, Michael, for future for when we do go into developing a deeper, a more specific scope of work, and work with you and your neighbors. So yeah, please provide your contact at as Rubina indicated, at the stressfreeconnections@lacity.org, because there will be future opportunities for us. This is just the first beginning phase of us taking on greater and greater definition of the types of things that we want to see on these corridors. So there's plenty of, I hope I'm not, I hope the point can be expressed that, or taken away, that the types of things that you're seeing in the presentation can certainly all be in the scope of work. We can explore solutions at minor intersections as well. We just didn't spend a lot of time on that in this presentation, just because we wanted to focus on the things that were seen to be the most mounting challenges of us, stitching together a network. But this is really a phased process. If anything, like, there's quick build solutions. We can coordinate with other programs like our speed hump program. We could coordinate, with other cities to see and hopefully see a layering effect over time. So you may not see all the changes come about at once, but I think that we could continue to refine and iterate and hopefully realize, a really grand vision for these corridors that you've seen in the presentation, that does include things like chicanes and neighborhood greening, which just takes, I think, a few, and that's the great thing I think about, planning for these neighborhood network corridors, is that you really can see these things develop one intervention at a time sometimes to really realize a grander vision. So we do hope that you continue to engage with LADOT, because this is part of our plan. We're committed to seeing this realized, and we're in it for the long haul. So we definitely will look forward to your continued engagement. And then let's see, we have a couple questions there. So Oren, you ask about what about basic infrastructure for cyclists, like loop detectors, bike boxes, signage, etc. So these are the types of things that would be expected to be, I think, scoped included in a scope of work, where loop detectors, presuming I think you're even thinking about regular intersections that may just have signals where they may not be loop detectors for bikes. If I'm getting that right, is there any more, I guess, is there any more details we should know about what you're thinking of? Let's see, I'll go to the
Lauren says you got it.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I do think that those are pretty low hanging fruit, but I think that they would be included in the scope of work for sure. And then Nikki is asking about cost of crosswalk at Packard and Fairfax. I'm not sure if we
David.
have that off, right?
I was gonna see if
What's
maybe
that?
Charlie, sorry, David, I didn't mean to jump in. I was just gonna see maybe
No, go
Charlie,
ahead.
do you want to talk a little bit about like maybe just the process and cost related to just general, I know you haven't done an assessment at this location, I imagine, but just more generally.
Sure. So I think cost-wise, it's definitely not significant for crosswalk, but for Packer and Fairfax, I'm not as familiar with the location, but just looking at it on Google Street View, I don't believe there's any. So it's stop controlled on Packer, but there's no existing control on Fairfax. So that's going to be a little challenging to put in a uncontrolled crosswalk. So that's where the RFBs, the pedestrian beacons, that's gonna be part of the equation if we do want to install a crosswalk. And typically in LADOT, we kind of go through a warrant process for crosswalks. So it depends on the number of pedestrians, and obviously there's probably not going to be a lot of pedestrian crossing right now because there's no crosswalk. But there's also there's a number of criteria like anticipated pedestrian crossing or facilities like schools or other major pedestrian destinations nearby. So I think cost-wise, it's not going to be much. I think it's going to be the process where, how do we determine if how do we install a crosswalk without, pedestrian beacons or some kind of control. I think I actually kind of want to go into the question that Oren had. What about basic infrastructure for cyclists? I think for loop detectors and bike boxes, those definitely is going to be take a little bit of money, and it might be something that's going to be included as part of the project later. But signage wise, I think that's something we can definitely work with the community with. So I can leave my email in the chat, and that's something, if you're interested, we can certainly take a closer look. I hope that kind of answers the questions. Great.
All right, and then also, and then for Nikki's question, I think we could follow up just on the general cost difference between some of the treatment, the devices that we've talked about in terms of the rapid flashing beacons or versus the pedestrian hybrid beacons. I think the pedestrian hybrid beacons, from what I understood, are more on the cost range of a full signal, which I think is, and I think costs have probably gone up since I last knew or was involved in projects that were scoping signals, but around $250,000 was the range I understood that we were estimating. I think for signals, I think RFBs would be substantially less, but we can follow up on that question. Let's see, we are, oh yeah, so I know we talked about next steps. I know for the sake of just, we're about time. We have one more poll for those that are still on the call, if you can entertain us that. If we forward there. And then Severin, would you want to administer the last poll to help everyone feel safe and comfortable? Would you be willing to address, the city should, the question is, the city should prioritize transportation investments that address climate change, equity, and public health. And whether or not you strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly agree with that statement. All right, and looks like, oh, good. Looks like we have the answer. Yeah, yep. So sharing the results of that. Great. It looks like we're in very strong agreement that the city should prioritize investments that address climate action, equity, and public health. So that's good to know that we have your support in making some solid progress there. I know that Rubina has provided this in the chat, but just in case, if at the next slide, you'll see if you can advance, Severin, our program or email is at stressfreeconnections@lacity.org, and the specific project webpage at for the Mid-City Stress-Free Project, where we can take more feedback there. That actually has an interactive portal. So a lot of the ideas that were discussed today about Whiteworth or minor intersections that could see some level of treatment or to address some of the conditions there, you could provide that in that interactive feature that's on our project page, which is another way we're collecting feedback. So with that, I want to just really just deeply thank you for taking the 2 hours this evening to get a grounding in the next phase of the Planning for Stress-Free Connections program. And we're just excited. I know I'm excited to hear about the positive feedback and some of the concerns that I think that we could rise to the challenge and on the specific program. So we really greatly appreciate your involvement, and thank you for those that did participate in the network audit that let us really have a deeper understanding of some of the barriers that we need to be addressed to have a greater stress-free travel experience for biking and walking. So with that, we can conclude the webinar, and I wish you all a great evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.